Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. We're going to be talking about social learning today and how it's changing, how we all learn in this new social age. You guys sent in some excerpts from a book on learning and development, and it's super fascinating to look at how tech is reshaping
Yeah.
knowledge itself. When you think about it, knowledge isn't just stuck in libraries or held by
hmm
a small group of experts anymore, right?
Yeah, that's so true. And it's really exciting to see the shift toward knowledge that's more
It's,
distributed,
mm,
more collaborative, and it's constantly changing. It's like the old model is being completely challenged by this new model, this free-flowing, community-driven approach.
yeah, it's pretty wild. The book uses this really cool example. Think about when you use your smartphone to
Mm.
quickly find some info to make a decision. You're not looking
Yeah.
for some big academic, peer-reviewed study, right, to
Sure.
tell you what to do. You just need enough to get by.
Exactly. And this shift has huge implications for learning. This book argues that it's not stuck in those formal settings or controlled by institutions anymore. We're seeing what's called social learning, learning that happens organically, often in community-based settings. It's driven by shared experiences and perspectives, not just what some textbook or curriculum tells you to know.
So it's less about structure and more about the interaction.
Yeah, you could say that. Formal learning is like a very carefully built lecture hall. Social learning is like a lively discussion around a campfire. They both have their place, but social learning is dynamic, relevant, and it adapts to the real world.
I can see why that would
Yeah.
appeal to people, especially now that the world is changing so fast. But isn't there a risk of information getting messed up or unreliable when it doesn't come from those traditional sources?
That's a good point. And the book talks about this. The shift to social learning does make us wonder about how reliable things are, the bias, and how we decide if information is good or not. It's exciting, but it can also be disruptive.
So how do we handle this new learning world? How do we make sure social learning is good and leads to positive outcomes?
That's where this concept of scaffolded social learning comes in. It's a framework for making good social learning experiences by building a support structure that guides these learning communities. It's not just throwing people
So
together.
there's still a purpose and structure to it.
Exactly. It's about making the right conditions for collaborating and sharing knowledge well. This scaffold has three parts. The first is formal knowledge that comes from organizations. The second is social knowledge that comes from the community itself. And the third is the knowledge and perspective that each person brings.
So it's combining these different types of knowledge to make it engaging and relevant. Makes me think about that study that the book mentions, one about healthcare workers
Yeah.
using tech to work together. I think it said they were using 17 different platforms,
Oh, yeah.
but only one was from their workplace.
Oh, yeah. That one's a great example of how learning is really spread out. These healthcare workers were using 16 platforms outside their formal systems.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
What does that tell us about how organizations are adapting to this new way of learning?
That's where we see this really interesting tension between formal learning and social learning. The formal system wants control and consistency, and it struggles to keep up with the dynamic and creative social systems.
Sounds like two different worlds.
Yeah, you could say that. The book uses the metaphor of a finely tuned instrument. You need the structure of the instrument and the freedom of the musician to make beautiful music.
So how do we find that balance? How do we use the power of social learning while making sure it fits with the goals of the organization?
That is the question. The book offers some interesting ideas about how organizations can build a thriving social learning culture. It talks about creating the right conditions and providing support, but it also talks about soft interventions.
Soft interventions, what does that look like?
Welcoming new members or making rituals for sharing learning stories. These small things can make a big difference.
So it's not about big gestures or initiatives.
Yeah.
It's about those small things that make people feel like they belong.
Right. It's about making a culture where people feel comfortable sharing their knowledge and learning from each other instead of waiting for instructions from the top.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
But how do we know if it's actually working? How do we measure social learning?
That's something a lot of organizations are trying to figure out. The book says it can be tricky because social learning is informal, unstructured, and hard to measure.
You can't just give people a pop quiz on their campfire discussions, right?
Right. The book suggests we focus on changes in behavior, how collaboration is improving, and new knowledge and insights.
So we're looking at the bigger picture
Yeah.
and how social learning is impacting people's work and the whole organization.
Yes. And the book says, don't get caught up in meaningless numbers. Focus on the data that tells a story and shows what's really happening.
Data that shows us how people are really learning and working together. But what about those who are learning outside the official structure of the organization?
That's where this idea of hidden communities comes in. These are groups of learners who connect and share knowledge outside of the official organization.
Hidden communities. That's interesting. Tell me more.
Think about those 16 unsanctioned platforms in the healthcare study. That's a great example. The book also talks about how informal groups on WhatsApp and Facebook can be super valuable for learning and support, even if they're not recognized by the organization.
So there's this whole underground network of learning.
Exactly. And the book even says this rise of hidden communities is formal subversion.
Formal subversion. Now, I'm really curious. What does that mean?
Well, that's a conversation that needs a little more time. Let's take a break and we'll come back and talk about this idea of formal subversion and how it relates to the power dynamics of social learning.
So before the break, we were talking about this idea of formal subversion. It sounds kind of rebellious, but I think there's more to it.
Yeah, there is. It's not about just getting rid of structure. It's about realizing that something needs to change. The book says that sometimes. The systems and processes, the ones that are supposed to guide us, can be so rigid that they actually stop progress and new ideas.
So people are finding workarounds
Yeah,
to get around all that red tape. They're not saying the whole system is bad. They're just trying to make it work.
exactly. And those workarounds, those acts of formal subversion can be really helpful. They highlight the places where the system isn't working and show us that we need to adapt.
Like that pressure valve. The healthcare study is a perfect example. Those 16 platforms that weren't approved were filling a need that the formal system wasn't.
Exactly. And this connects to a bigger point about power. As these social learning communities get stronger, they're going to challenge the way power works now.
Like power is shifting from the top down to a more spread out model where knowledge and being an expert are valued no matter where they come from.
That's it. And the book says that. Organizations need to find a way to embrace this shift without losing sight of their goals.
That sounds like a challenge. How do you give people freedom without losing control?
It's not easy, but the book has some ideas. One is transparency. Organizations need to be open with their employees about why they're trying social learning and what it means for how they work.
So building trust and understanding. You can't just expect people to do things differently without explaining why it's important.
Right. And you need clear guidelines. Social learning is about empowering people, but it's not a free-for-all. Organizations need to set expectations for how people behave, communicate, and share knowledge.
Freedom within a framework. But how do we make sure those frameworks support social learning? We talked about scaffolded social learning earlier. Does the book give examples of how to use this framework?
It does. It says it's important to combine formal knowledge, social knowledge, and individual knowledge. One example is building a strong sense of community. Remember those soft interventions we talked about? Like welcoming new members and making rituals for sharing learning stories.
Those can really make people feel like they belong and that their work matters.
Exactly. And the book goes even deeper into the power of rituals and symbols in building a shared identity and purpose.
Okay, like what?
Imagine a team that has a special space for sharing learning experiences. Maybe they call it the Knowledge Nook. Or a company that celebrates learning wins every week. Small things like that can have a big impact on creating a culture that values social learning.
It's about being intentional and creating those moments that reinforce
Yeah,
how important learning and sharing are. But I imagine leadership is key here, right?
absolutely. The book says that leaders need to be champions for social learning. They need to show the behaviors they want to see and make a safe space for trying new things.
So it's not just talk. Leaders have to actually do it.
It's about moving away from that old top-down way of leading to something more collaborative. The book calls this social leadership,
Right.
where people in the community step up to help others learn, share what they know, and mentor others.
So less about telling people what to do and more about helping them learn and grow.
Exactly. And the book has some examples of organizations that are already doing this. One company uses social learning to come up with new ideas. They have an online platform where employees from all levels can connect, share ideas, and work on projects together.
That would definitely break down barriers.
So what about the people who don't like change? Not everyone wants to let go of the old ways.
That's true. The book says that resistance to change is one of the biggest problems when trying to do social learning. A lot of organizations have cultures and processes that just don't work with this new way of learning.
So how do you get past that?
It takes a few things.
Hmm.
The book says communication and education are important. Help people understand why social learning is good and how it can make their work better.
So you're not just telling people what to do, you're bringing them along.
Exactly. And involve them in the process. Ask for their ideas. Talk to them. And make them feel like they're part of the solution.
It takes patience, empathy, and a real commitment to making a better learning environment. It does. And leaders are important here too. They need to be the ones pushing for change, setting the example, and making a culture where it's okay to try new things and learn from mistakes.
It's about changing your mindset
Yeah.
from I know everything to we can learn together.
Exactly. And the book has some advice on how to do that well. It says it's important to create feedback loops, check on your progress, and get learners involved in seeing how things are going.
So it's not just a one-time thing.
Right. It's a constant process of learning, adapting, and changing.
But even with all that, how do we know if it's working? How do we measure social learning?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll talk about after a quick break. We'll look at how to measure the benefits of social learning and why it's so important to look beyond the usual ways of measuring things. So we've been talking about social learning and how it's really changing the way we learn and grow in this world where everyone's connected.
Yeah, we talked about those hidden communities and that tension between how organizations want to do things and how social learning actually works.
Right, and how companies need to be more open to collaboration.
And give their people more power to learn and grow.
Exactly. But how do we measure something like social learning?
Yeah, it's not as easy as looking at test scores or how many courses people finish, right?
You got it. The book says we need to look beyond those old ways of measuring and see the bigger picture.
So what are we looking for? How do we know if social learning is actually working?
The book says focus on how people's behavior changes, how their teamwork gets better, and if they come up with new ideas.
So we're looking for that ripple effect.
Mm-hmm.
How is social learning changing the way people work together and solve problems?
Exactly. It's about seeing how social learning helps the organization reach its goals and helps people grow.
But how do you measure those things that are hard to see?
It can be tough, but the book gives some advice. It says to use different ways to gather information, like surveys, interviews, watching what people do, and looking at how they interact online.
So you're getting information from lots of different places to get a better understanding of what's going on.
Exactly. And the book says it's important to ask the learners themselves. Ask them what they're learning, how they're using it, and what problems they're having.
Makes sense. They're the ones actually doing the learning.
Right. And remember, this isn't a one-time thing. It's a constant process of learning, adapting, and getting better.
So you're always getting feedback.
Yeah.
Making changes.
Exactly. It's about having a culture where you're always experimenting and getting better. The book says this is really important for social learning to work well and last.
It's like you're building the plane as you fly it.
I like that. It shows how dynamic and adaptable social learning is.
So we've talked about what social learning is and how to do it, but I think we need to talk about why it matters.
The why is super important. The book says something really powerful about this. It says, as learners become more empowered, they will drive the future of learning.
Wow. That's inspiring. It means social learning isn't just about learning new things. It's about changing who has the power.
Exactly. It's about giving people the power to take control of their own learning and growth and to help shape the future of knowledge.
So what can we do to make this happen in our own lives and careers?
The book has some good ideas. First, be curious, always ask questions, challenge what you think you know, and look for new ways of seeing things.
Be open to learning from anyone.
Second, build your network. Connect with people who have the same interests as you, both online and offline. Join groups. Go to events and have good conversations.
Like those hidden communities we talked about.
Right. Third, share what you know. Don't keep it all to yourself. Teach other people. Be a mentor and contribute to your community.
It's amazing how much you learn when you teach someone else.
I agree. And finally, experiment. Don't be afraid to try new things, mess up, and learn from it. Social learning is a journey.
It's about growing and discovering.
The book leaves us with a question. What will you do to shape the future of learning in your own life and community?
That's a good question to think about. We hope this deep dive gave you some things to think about and showed you how powerful social learning can be.
Thanks for joining us.
We'll be back next week with another deep dive. Until then, keep learning, keep connecting, and keep sharing.